What do you think about the response that goes like this? Well, it sounds like what you're inviting us to do is to think of the deliverances of faith as part of the data on which we theorize, but that's not really science. That's something else. That's theology or religion, and scientists, qua scientists, can't do that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes there are sort of two different kinds of reasons given. One reason given for that, and we could call this methodological naturalism, right? So as a constraint on science and maybe on scholarship more generally, some people suggest that one should proceed as if God weren't there. You don't say God isn't there, but you proceed as if God isn't there. To do otherwise is, as you suggest, not to do science or psychology or for that matter, history or whatever. To do otherwise is to do theology. And if you were to ask, well, okay, why do you say that? Why do you think that? Why do you think that's a constraint on proper scientific or proper scholarly activity? One response is, well, it's true by definition. For example, Michael Roos makes that suggestion. Nancy Murphy makes that suggestion. And other people make the suggestion too. Well, I don't see how you can settle any kind of substantive important issue by a definition. I mean, suppose I define the term Democrat as to mean unmitigated scoundrel. Does that mean Democrats around the world should all go around hanging their heads because they're unmitigated scoundrels? You can't settle an important issue like that by a definition. But even if you said, well, that really is the definition of science, then I'd say what Christians who are scientists ought to be involved in is something, we'll call it schmience, just like science, except it doesn't suffer from this methodological constraint. And then the other suggestion, the other kind of reason some people give for the suggestion you make, that if you start from the deliverances of faith, you've just got theology but don't have psychology or whatever. The other suggestion, the other reason for that suggestion comes from some kinds of Thomists. They distinguish, for example, Etienne Gilson. They distinguish reason from faith, and then they point out that faith, or they say at least, whether it's pointing out that's quite the same question. Faith is a matter of testimony. What you take on faith, you take as testimony. Maybe God's testimony, but still testimony. And what you know by way of reason is something that you know by, you might say, sight. It's something you figure out for yourself. And then you really master it. You have a better grasp of it. You might say you know it better. So if you just tell me, for example, I don't know, that no system of arithmetic is complete, and you tell me this and tell me what it means, and I believe you, then I know that. But if I can actually follow a proof of this claim, this theorem, from propositions that I can see to be self-evident, then I've got a much better grasp of it. So that's the thought. If you, when you start from faith, you'll wind up with a discourse that doesn't have as great, you might say, positive epistemic status or status as knowledge as you do if you start if you just stick within the bounds of reason. And very briefly, the response to that is that people who think this way seem to me to fail to notice that, for example, the deliverances of reason, what is self-evident, let's say, comes in degrees. So 2 + 1 = 3, absolutely, top of the line. You can't get more positive epistemic status, maybe. You can't know anything better than the way in which we know that 2 + 1 = 3. But typically in philosophy, you go beyond things like 2 + 1 = 3 in philosophy and other disciplines. And when it comes to other propositions that are much more philosophical significance, of much greater philosophical significance, for example, there aren't any things that don't exist. That's something I think is self-evident, but not nearly as self-evident, you might say. It doesn't have nearly as much intuitive support or self-evidentiary support as 2 + 1 = 3. And then if you ask whether, with respect to all these deliverances of reason, you know all of them better than you know what you know by way of testimony, I'd have to say I rather doubt that. I mean, I know by testimony that my name is Al Plantinga. I know by testimony that it's Michigan that I live in. I think I know those things at least as well, or maybe better, that I know that there aren't any things that don't exist. And similarly for lots of other philosophical propositions, I might believe, and propositions that one finds in the sciences too. So I think I don't think there's good reason to accept this constraint.
Mm-hmm. Nick, I know you've written and thought about these kinds of issues. Did you want to weigh in?
Well, I think what Al early in his discourse said, the Christian philosopher now, other Christian academics, but the Christian philosopher, should set his or her own project agenda. I think that's true, but only in a certain sense. Al mentioned the evolutionary psychology, and it seems to me the Christian setting your own agenda has to be understood in such a sense that the Christian won't just ignore other developments in his or her field. Not every development. Some developments in one's field are not worth paying attention to. But philosophy and the other disciplines, philosophy is an ongoing human dialogue. It doesn't belong to Christians, it doesn't belong to naturalists, it doesn't belong to Muslims, it doesn't belong to Buddhists, it's all of us together. And we set our own agendas, but in the light of what's transpiring in the discipline. So what do you think, Al? I mean, setting one's own agenda without some qualification or expansion can sound as if Christian scholarship is a hole and corner thing. You do your own
Right,
thing and,
yeah.
and let those evolutionary psychologists do their thing, and
No, I
we'll just
don't
do our thing.
I don't mean that. I don't mean to. I don't mean that as a consequence at all.
Yeah.
But it seems to me advice nowadays, at least. I mean, what kind of advice is relevant depends on the whole situation and how things stand at the moment. And at the moment, it seems to me that, say, in psychology, Christian psychologists, again, I feel very uneasy saying this because I'm not a psychologist. I don't know that much about. My father was, but I'm not. Are much more inclined not to be a hole in the corner, to get into this corner and just do their own thing, but to do what's done in mainstream psychology. And of course, it's very easy to see why that would be the case. We go to graduate school, and in graduate school, the graduate schools we go to are substantially secular graduate schools. In graduate school, you learn to do things in your discipline. You learn to do them the way in which they're done in that discipline. And stepping outside that seems weird or strange or sort of like a weird uncle, something like that, you know. So the fact is, you're quite right. Christian scholars are addressing at least two different communities, maybe more than, actually more than two, but at least two. On the one hand, you might say they're inward looking. They're thinking as Christians in the Christian community. What does the Christian community need to learn in this connection, and how, from a Christian perspective, should one think about, say, hostility? But on the other hand, they're members of a guild, and they play a part in that guild. So they're inward looking, but also outward looking. And in fact, there are many more communities involved too. Christian scholars sometimes address other scholars, but they should also sometimes address the laity. And they should address the Christian laity, but also the non-Christian laity. So it's a kind of a complicated dance more than just a...
So I think that's the advice that mainly calls for being given, but one wants to prevent misunderstandings. People misunderstanding the advice in such a way that, well, we forget what all the other people are doing. We set our own agenda. And in fact, what you were saying there, secondly, we're part of this guild, of this ongoing practice of philosophy, and you're in my case. And we as Christians do our best to be persuasive. We don't just stand on a Hyde Park corner and pronounce this is the truth of the matter, but do our best to get people to see things our way, anticipating in advance that one will not be entirely successful with that. No philosopher is ever entirely successful in persuading any other philosopher of anything. So that's, but you do your best. You look for the pry points, as I sometimes put it, the points that the other person said, I hadn't thought about that. I'll have to go home and think about that.
But I think that's just part of it, though. I mean, so if I address other philosophers generally, not philosophers who are specifically Christian at all, but just any philosophers of any sort, then what I can start from and what I assume will be quite different from what I can if you and I want to talk and I want to tell you, well, here's the right way to think about knowledge from a Christian perspective, then I can start from what you and I have in common. And if it's important to look at these phenomena from a Christian perspective, then some of our energy ought to be devoted to that. I don't want to say all of it or 9 out of 9/10 of it or anything, but an important part of it.
Right. But I think we want to add that the agenda of, let me just call it the rest of the philosophical guild, the counterpart in other disciplines, the agendas actually of the rest of the philosophical guild will rarely be totally misguided. There will usually be something that they're onto that's important to pay attention to. I mean, this is just good doctrine. Scripture doesn't tell us that all but Christians are totally benighted about everything.
No, I mean, I remember when you and I were in college, we sometimes thought about C. Van Til.
Yes.
And we probably thought about him in a completely wrong way. I mean,
this is Cornelius Van Til?
Cornelius Van Til, right. But what I heard from people in those days, and I didn't read much Cornelius Van Til himself, was that Cornelius Van Til thought that only Christians knew anything. And
of course, there was a somewhat arch definition of "know" operative there, but be that as it may.
And that other unbelievers, they didn't really know anything. Well, then at the time I was reading a book by Willard Van Orman Quine, who was not a Christian, a book on logic.
And you found some truths in it.
And the thought that he didn't know any logic, well, why am I reading him? He doesn't know any logic anyway. That made absolutely no sense, right.
There's this eloquent passage in Calvin's Institutes, 2:215, as I recall, in which Calvin praises the ancient jurists, the ancient philosophers, and so forth, and says that this is not the work of the devil, but it's the work of the Spirit, and we are being ungrateful if we don't acknowledge that there's much to be admired.
Absolutely right, yeah. But still, saying all that, it's important. In philosophy, this advice maybe isn't as crucial or necessary now as it was 25 years ago when I wrote that piece, or 30 years ago or whatever. But I think in other parts of the whole Christian academic enterprise, that advice still needs to be given.
Correct.
People still are too, they're buffaloed by the whole establishment of the discipline in question. Maybe in philosophy it's easier not to be buffaloed because philosophers always thoroughly disagree with each other anyway. Right. But in some other disciplines, there's almost a premium on fitting in and sort of a conformity with how this discipline is done.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.